On the night of November 27th, 1542, 16 women walked into the private chamber of the most powerful man on earth. They carried no weapons, no swords, no poison, no daggers, just a silk ribbon. The Emperor of China, the Zhang Emperor, ruler of 120 million people, commander of the largest army on the planet, a man who called himself the Son of Heaven, was asleep. They held down his arms. They stuffed cloth into his mouth, and one woman, a palace maid named Yang Jinying, looped the silk ribbon around his throat and pulled. His body convulsed, his face changed colour, then he stopped moving. For approximately 2 minutes, the Emperor of China was either dead or dying, and 16 women with no military training, no political allies, and no escape plan had done what no general in the empire had managed. Then the knot jammed. The ribbon wouldn't tighten further. Panic set in. One woman ran to the Empress and confessed everything. Guards arrived within minutes. The Emperor was revived. And what happened next to those 16 women, and to their families, their villages, and everyone connected to their bloodlines, became one of the most documented mass punishments in Imperial Chinese history. But here's what makes this story different from every other assassination attempt you've heard. These women knew they would die. They knew their families would die. They knew there was almost no chance of success, and they did it anyway. Which means whatever was happening inside that palace, whatever these women were experiencing every single day, was so extreme that mass execution felt like the better option. This is the story of what drove them there, and it starts long before the Zhang Emperor was born. To understand what happened in 1542, you need to understand the system that had been running for centuries before it. The Chinese imperial palace was not a residence. It was a logistical operation, one of the most complex personnel management systems in the ancient world. At its peak under the Ming dynasty, the Forbidden City housed between 9,000 and 20,000 women at any given time. That number is not symbolic. It comes from palace census records and eunuch registries that survived into the modern era. These women were organized into a strict hierarchy. At the top sat the empress. Below her ranked consorts. Below them, concubines of various grades. Below them, attendants. And at the very bottom, palace maids. Women who performed labor, served higher-ranking women, and existed in a category that had almost no path upward. Here is how women entered this system. Every few years, imperial officials fanned out across the empire. Their task was specific: locate girls between the ages of 13 and 16 who met the dynasty's physical and genealogical requirements. Local magistrates submitted candidates. Families could not refuse. The girls were examined in stages, first for physical appearance, then for health, then for temperament. Those who passed were transported to the capital. The journey itself could take weeks. Many girls came from southern provinces, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Huguang, regions known for producing women who matched the aesthetic standards of the court. They travelled by canal boat and overland cart, chaperoned by eunuchs, with no guarantee of what awaited them. Once inside the palace, their names were recorded in registries. Their home identities were functionally erased. They were assigned ranks, quarters, and duties. Most would never leave. Life inside the palace walls followed a rhythm dictated entirely by protocol. Women rose before dawn. Their movements were tracked by eunuchs, castrated men who served as the palace's internal security force. Under the Ming dynasty, the eunuch population inside the Forbidden City numbered between 12,000 and 20,000. They monitored hallways, recorded conversations, and reported any deviation from expected behavior. The women were not permitted to leave the palace grounds. Communication with the outside world was restricted or prohibited entirely. Letters home were censored or blocked. Visitors from families were rare and heavily supervised. Within the palace, social dynamics operated on a single axis: proximity to the emperor. A woman who attracted the emperor's attention could rise from maid to consort. A woman who fell out of favor could be reassigned to manual labor, sent to the laundry service, or confined to quarters indefinitely. This created a social environment defined by one feature: every relationship was transactional. Alliances formed and dissolved based on access. Friendships carried risk. If a friend fell out of favor, association with her could mean punishment. Accusations of disloyalty, witchcraft, or sexual misconduct circulated constantly, and the consequences were not theoretical. Women were executed on suspicion of poisoning. Women were beaten for speaking to the wrong person. Women disappeared from their quarters and were never mentioned again. This system operated continuously for dynasty after dynasty. The women changed, the rules did not. And then Zhu Haokong took the throne. Zhu Haokong was not supposed to become emperor. He was a regional prince, the son of the Prince of Qing, raised in Hubei province, far from the capital. When the Zhengde emperor died in 1521 without an heir, the court selected Zhu Haokong as the closest eligible relative. He was 14 years old. His first years on the throne were defined by a power struggle known to historians as the Great Rights Controversy. The court demanded he retroactively adopt the previous emperor as his father, a symbolic act that would legitimize his succession. He refused. He wanted his biological father recognized instead. The conflict lasted 3 years. Officials protested. Over 200 were arrested. 17 were beaten so severely during court flogging sessions that several died. He won. That confrontation established a pattern. Zhu Haokong learned early that direct force, applied without negotiation, produced results, and the bureaucracy learned that this emperor would not tolerate opposition. By the late 1530s, the Jiajing emperor had largely stopped governing. He attended fewer and fewer court sessions. He communicated with ministers through written notes delivered by eunuchs. For stretches of months, no official saw the emperor's face. The reason was specific. He had become consumed by Taoist practices aimed at extending his life. This was not casual spirituality. The emperor built dedicated altar complexes within the Forbidden City. He employed a rotating staff of Taoist priests. He participated in elaborate rituals lasting hours, fasting, meditating, burning talismans, and consuming alchemical preparations. 2 men in particular gained enormous influence during this period: Xiao Yuanji and Tao Zhongwen, Taoist masters who convinced the emperor that physical immortality was achievable through the correct combination of ritual practice and alchemical substances. The emperor believed them, and the substances they prescribed required specific ingredients. This is where the historical record becomes difficult to read, not because the sources are unclear, but because what they describe is specific and consistent across multiple accounts. The Jiajing emperor's alchemists prescribed a substance, referred to in court records as red lead. The production of red lead required young women, specifically girls who had recently reached puberty. Court physicians and Taoist priests supervised the extraction process. The historical sources describe forced regimens designed to manipulate the girls' biological cycles using herbal preparations, restricted diets, and physical exhaustion. The number of girls cycled through this process is not precisely known, but palace records from the period reference hundreds. Girls were brought in from the annual selection process, used in these preparations, and either retained in the palace or discarded when they were no longer useful. Here is what the daily reality looked like for women in the Jiajing Emperor's palace, drawn from the surviving accounts. Before sunrise, in some accounts as early as the 3rd watch, roughly 1 to 3 a.m., palace women were required to go into the Imperial gardens. Their task was to collect morning dew from specific plants. This dew was used in alchemical preparations. The collection had to happen before dawn because the dew was considered to lose its properties after sunrise. The women performed this task regardless of weather. In winter, temperatures in Beijing dropped well below freezing. The women's clothing was designed for indoor palace life. Layered silk, not cold weather protection. Women who collapsed were punished. Women who failed to collect sufficient quantities were punished. Women who showed visible signs of illness were removed, not for treatment, but because illness was interpreted as spiritual contamination that could compromise the purity of the ingredients. Girls involved in the red lead extraction process were placed on controlled diets. They consumed specific herbal preparations, some of which contained ingredients now known to be toxic, on rigid schedules. The goal was to regulate and intensify their biological processes to maximize the yield of the substances the alchemists needed. Side effects included severe abdominal pain, hemorrhaging, chronic fatigue, and in documented cases, death. The girls who died were replaced from the same selection pipeline that had brought them in. There was no record of any girl being returned to her family. What distinguished the Jiajing Emperor's palace from those of previous rulers was not the existence of these practices. Earlier dynasties had their own alchemical traditions, but the industrial scale. The emperor's obsession intensified over decades. As each preparation failed to produce immortality, the alchemists prescribed more elaborate rituals, requiring more ingredients, more participants, and more extreme conditions. Palace women who served in non-alchemical roles were not exempt from the atmosphere this created. The entire palace operated under a heightened state of surveillance and punishment. Minor infractions, speaking at the wrong time, moving through the wrong corridor, failing to complete a task quickly enough, drew responses that in previous reigns would have been reserved for serious offences. Beatings became routine, confinement became routine, and the women who witnessed others being punished understood exactly what the pattern meant for their own futures. This went on for over 20 years. The assassination attempt of 1542 did not happen spontaneously. According to the investigation records, compiled afterward, records that survived because the court needed to document the full scope of the conspiracy. The plot was organised over a period of weeks. The ringleader was Yang Jinying, a palace maid. The sources describe her as someone who had served in the palace long enough to understand its rhythms, the guard rotations, the emperor's habits, the points in the evening when surveillance was lightest. She recruited 15 others. The investigation records name most of them: Yang Chuiying, Su Chuanfang, Xing Suilian, Liu Miaoqing, among others. Their ranks varied, some were maids, some were attendants, but they shared a common position at the bottom of the palace hierarchy. These were not women with political ambitions. The investigation found no evidence of external conspirators, no connections to court factions, no backing from rival claimants to the throne. Every source that examined the plot reached the same conclusion. These women were trying to kill the emperor because they wanted the conditions of their lives to stop. The plan was simple because it had to be. The women had no access to weapons. Knives, scissors, and sharp implements were strictly controlled within the inner palace. Poison was theoretically possible, but required access to the emperor's food supply, which was managed by a separate chain of eunuchs with their own security protocols. Strangulation required no materials beyond what the women already possessed. They chose a night when the emperor would be sleeping in the chambers of Consort Chao, one of his favorites at the time. The location mattered because it was part of the inner residential complex, where the security presence was lighter than in the formal palace buildings. The timing was calculated around the guard rotation. The women would enter together, restrain the emperor physically, prevent him from calling for help, and use a silk cord to strangle him. The plan had one structural problem that the women either didn't anticipate or couldn't solve. None of them had ever killed anyone before. The accounts of what happened that night come from the official investigation conducted in the days that followed. The interrogations were thorough. The court needed to determine whether this was an isolated act or part of a larger conspiracy. Here is the sequence, reconstructed from those records. The 16 women entered the emperor's sleeping chamber sometime after he had fallen asleep. They moved together. Some sources suggest they had rehearsed their roles: who would hold which limb, who would handle the gag, who would apply the cord. Several women pinned the emperor's body to the bed. Others forced cloth into his mouth to muffle any sound. Yang Jinying placed the silk ribbon around his neck and began pulling. The emperor fought. Despite being restrained by multiple people, he was not immediately subdued. The struggle caused enough noise and movement that the women had to continuously